Look, we've always assumed that being America's neighbor meant having a front row seat to the greatest economic engine on Earth. We assumed the driveway between us and Canada was a permanent way street pointing south. But what if I told you that while Washington was busy threatening a tariff war, Ottawa was quietly building a backdoor billion, a $780 billion Arctic exit that renders the U.S. border irrelevant? It's a masterclass in geopolitical divorce, and it all started with a single $1 receipt. Because you see, there is a certain kind of vulnerability, a specific stomach-turning kind of exposure that comes from being what we call landlocked. But I'm not talking about maps or mountains. In the world of geopolitics, being landlocked is often a choice made by your neighbors. It is the realization that your ability to feed your people or sell your goods, or even keep the lights on, doesn't actually belong to you. It belongs to the person who owns the driveway. And for 80 years, Canada realized they didn't own the keys. And if that person, the one who owns the driveway, decides they don't like you anymore, or if they decide that your lunch should actually be their lunch, they don't need to invade you. They don't need to fire a single shot. They just have to close the gate. In the 1980s, the nations of Zimbabwe and Zambia lived in that exact state of terminal anxiety. They were young, they were independent, and they were resourcery. They had minerals the world craved and grain that could feed a continent. But there was a problem, a map-shaped, ironclad problem. To get their goods to the world, they had to send them south. They had to use the railroads and the deep-water ports of South Africa. At the time, South Africa was governed by the apartheid regime, a government that was increasingly isolated, increasingly paranoid, and perfectly willing to use its driveway as a gout. If Zimbabwe spoke up too loudly at the UN, the trains slowed down. If Zambia supported the wrong political movement, suddenly there was a shortage of rail cars. It was logistical strangulation as a domestic policy. And for a long time, the world assumed there was nothing those nations could do about it. South Africa held the keys. They owned the ports. They owned the destiny of their neighbors. Until they didn't. In 1986, these nations did something that wasn't supposed to be economically optimal. They decided to build their own way out. They looked at a dilapidated, narrow strip of land through war-torn Mozambique called the Barra Corridor. It was expensive. It was a logistical nightmare. It was, according to every serious economist at the time, a redundant waste of money because the South African routes were already built. Why reinvent the wheel? They reinvented it because they realized that a redundant railroad is only redundant if your neighbor isn't trying to bankrupt you. They called it the frontline strategy. They rebuilt the tracks, they fortified the port, and they effectively divorced themselves from South African leverage. By the time the apartheid government realized they were losing their grip, it was too late. The trade had moved. The leverage had evaporated. The driveway was empty. For 40 years, we looked at that story as a fascinating, dusty relic of Cold War-era African history, a lesson in logistics as sovereignty for a world that didn't exist anymore. After all, we live in the era of integrated global markets. We have trade deals. We have the USMCA. We are neighbors and friends and partners. We don't use railroads as weapons of war anymore, right? Well, last December, when Donald Trump stood up and threatened very severe tariffs on Canadian fertilizer, effectively threatening to bankrupt the Saskatchewan prairie and freeze the American farmer, in one breath, he thought he was holding all the keys. He looked at the map and saw a Canada that was landlocked by American infrastructure. He saw a Canada that had to ship through New Orleans and Vancouver. He thought he was the one with the gate. But what the White House missed, what they completely, fundamentally failed to see, was that while they were busy dusting off the old 1980s playbook of logistical strangulation, Ottawa was busy studying the Beara Corridor. And as of tonight, Canada hasn't just found a new driveway. They've built a $780 billion door to the world that Washington cannot touch. And it all started with a $1 receipt. To understand how a mid-sized power like Canada pulls off a $780 billion decoupling, you have to look past the political theater. You have to look at the plumbing. For decades, the plumbing of North American trade was a one-way street pointing south. If you are a farmer in Saskatchewan, you are sitting on the world's most valuable deposit of potash, the literal lifeblood of global industrial agriculture. Without it, the world doesn't eat. But potash is heavy. It's bulky. It's not something you can just put in the back of a truck and drive to market. You need the iron highway. This is what we call logistical path dependency. Because the American rail networks are so massive and the Gulf ports are so established, Canadian exports have been performing this absurd, expensive U-turn for nearly a century. Every ton of that fertilizer that crosses the border into North Dakota or Minnesota becomes subject to American law. It pays American rail fees. It is handled by American longshoremen. And most crucially for the current occupant of the Oval Office, it is subject to the Bill of Leading Jurisdiction of the United States. When the president threatened those severe tariffs in December, he wasn't just threatening a tax, he was threatening to seize the plumbing. He believed that because the pipes ran through his basement, he owned the water. But here is the forensic reality that Washington missed. Canada wasn't just complaining about the tariffs. They were changing the state of the water. Enter the mechanism infrastructural autoarchy. In January 2025, while the transition team in D.C. was busy drawing up tariff schedules, a company called Genesis Fertilizers was quietly signing a deal with the Arctic Gateway Group. This wasn't just a shipping contract. It was a jurisdictional bypass. By moving the point of export from the Gulf of Mexico to the Port of Churchill in northern Manitoba, Canada effectively repatriated its own supply chain. When a shipment of potash leaves Churchill, it never touches American soil. It never triggers a U.S. customs event. It never enters the jurisdiction of the Commerce Department. It is a sovereign transaction from a Canadian mine to a European buyer facilitated by a Canadian port. President's severe tariffs didn't just fail to collect revenue, they became irrelevant. You cannot tax a ghost. You cannot leverage a supply chain that has vanished from your map. And this is where the competence porn really kicks in. This wasn't just a private sector move. This was a state-sponsored exit strategy led by Prime Minister Mark Carney. Carney, a man who headed both the Bank of Canada and the Bank of England, understands something the current administration seems to have forgotten. Capital follows the path of least resistance. By injecting $180 million of federal money into Churchill's infrastructure, new grain handling systems, icebreaker support, modernize rail. The Canadian government didn't just fix a port, they created an economic vacuum that is currently sucking $780 billion worth of future trade out of the American heartland and dragging it north. The White House thought they were playing a game of the art of the deal, where you squeeze the partner until they cave. They didn't realize they were playing against a central banker who knows that if you squeeze a liquid hard enough, it doesn't compress. It just finds a new pipe. And if you want to know just how long Canada has been waiting to install this new pipe, you have to look at a single dusty document from 1997. A document that proves Washington didn't just lose this game. They sold the winning card for the price of a candy bar. When a politician tells you they've been blindsided by a crisis, your first instinct should always be to check the filing cabinet. because usually the surprise was sitting there in black and white for 30 years, waiting for someone to notice. The White House's defense for the chaos currently unfolding in the Midwest, the sudden drop in rail traffic, the empty silos in New Orleans, is that Canada is cheating. That this Churchill pivot is some kind of illegal trade subsidy. But if you want to see the actual moment the United States lost its grip on the North, you don't look at a 2026 trade brief. You look at a sales receipt from 1997. In 1997, the Canadian government, in a fit of peak 92 neoliberalism, decided that the Port of Churchill and its 800-meter rail line were non-core assets. They wanted them off the books, and they sold them to a private American company based in Denver called Omnitras. The price? $1. Think about that. The only deep-water Arctic port in North America, the Bayraki of the North, was sold for less than the price of a local newspaper. For nearly 3 decades, we treated that port like a joke. We assumed that because an American company owned the tracks, the Canadian government had effectively surrendered its northern sovereignty. And for a while, we were right. In 2017, when record flooding washed out the tracks, Omnitras didn't fix them. They looked at the balance sheet, and they just walked away. They left the people of Churchill stranded. They let the port rot. Washington looked at that ruin and saw a dead end. But Canada saw a smoking gun. They realized that depending on American private interests for sovereign infrastructure was a suicide pact, and they've been quietly waiting for a reason to take it back. Donald Trump gave them that reason in December. Here are the receipts the White House is trying to ignore. The administration claims Churchill is a ghost port that can't handle the volume. But look at the numbers in the Genesis Fertilizers partnership. They aren't just shipping a few bags of potting soil. We're talking about 1 million tons of fertilizer production annually. We're talking about 29 million tons of grain that currently goes through Vancouver and the US that is now being bid on by European buyers who want it through the Arctic. Why? Because Churchill cuts 6 days off the delivery time. 6 days. In the shipping world, 6 days is an eternity. It's the difference between a profit margin and a total loss. And for the skeptics who say the Arctic is too frozen to be a threat, look at the $180 million federal commitment from the Carney government. They aren't just buying shovels. They are buying icebreaker support for year-round transit. They are building a northern corridor that the U.S. has no legal standing to block. Because, and this is the part that really stings, we are the ones who walked away from it first. The administration's Art of the Deal strategy was built on the assumption that Canada was stuck with us, that the 1997 status quo was permanent. But the facts show that while Washington was busy using the front door to threaten a tariff war, Canada was quietly renovating the back door. And they didn't just open it, they reinforced it, they ensured it, and they started charging the world $780 billion to use it. The cheating isn't coming from Ottawa. The failure is coming from a White House that forgot that in a global economy, the person who owns the most convenient door eventually owns the room. We are currently standing at the edge of a map that is being redrawn in real time. And as we move into this 2026 midterm season, the political fallout of the Churchill pivot is starting to land exactly where the White House said it wouldn't, right in the American heartland. For the last year, the administration's rhetoric has been built on a very specific promise. They told workers in New Orleans and rail engineers in Illinois and port authorities in the Gulf that America first meant the world had to come through us, that we were the indispensable middleman of the global economy. But as it turns out, Indispensable is a very dangerous thing to assume you are. When that $780 billion in trade redirects north over the next decade, it doesn't just vanish into the Arctic mist. It leaves a hole. It leaves empty rail cars sitting on sidings in North Dakota. It leaves grain elevators in the Midwest waiting for a logistics fee that is never coming. And why? Because we forgot the most basic rule of the neighborhood. If you make it too difficult, too expensive, too politically volatile for your neighbors to use your front door, they will eventually stop knocking. This isn't just about potash, and it isn't just about a 25% tariff on canola. This is about the end of the continental assumption. For 80 years, American foreign policy toward Canada was based on the idea that they were a captive economy. We assumed that because they shared a continent with us, they shared a destiny with us. We thought we were the only game in town. But Mark Carney and the Canadian government just proved that in a warming world and in a technologically advancing world, the neighborhood is getting bigger. By pivoting to the Arctic, Canada is doing more than just bypassing a tariff, are auditioning for a role in a new global order. A world where the Northwest Passage becomes the new Suez Canal. A world where the Northern Corridor links the prairies of North America directly to the markets of Europe and Asia, entirely outside the reach of the U.S. Treasury. They aren't just leaving the room. They are building a new wing on the house. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a choice. We can continue to treat trade as a series of wins and losses in a zero-sum game. Or we can realize that our strength has always been built on the stability of our partnerships. When you treat your closest ally like a subordinate, you don't make them loyal, you make them independent. The Port of Churchill is no longer a $1 joke. It is a monument to a strategic miscalculation. It is a reminder that sovereignty isn't just a flag or a border. It's the ability to say no to a neighbor who thinks they own your driveway. Canada just said no, and they said it to the tune of $780 billion. We'll be watching the rail traffic numbers out of Manitoba as the spring thaw begins, because if those ships start moving, they aren't coming back. The driveway is empty, the gate is open, and the world is moving north.